Hello, and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Spencer Klavan. He is a classicist, an editor at the American Mind, an editor at the Claremont Institute, host of the Young Heretics podcast, and also the author of How to Save the West. Nice modest ambition there in the title. We spoke about how we save the West and the re-enchantment of the West. We spoke about magic, prophesying, angels, demons. In the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about classical ideas about sexuality and about masculinity and femininity and whether we've lost something by forgetting these old ideas. That extended version of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com. Remember, Maiden Mother Matriarch is a subscriber-funded podcast. I'm entirely reliant on your generosity in signing up for paid subscriptions. At the Substack, you can also find bonus episodes. I do fortnightly episodes with my husband, as well as the whole back catalogue of extended episodes and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Spencer, I try not to start interviews by forcing people to give me their biographies because I always find it a bit stressful when I'm asked to offer up my biography on air. But in your case, I have heard you speak so beautifully about, in particular, your childhood interest in classics, which is, I think, a more passionate and more early interest than any I've ever come across before.
Oh, wow. Yeah, okay.
My husband did classics, and I've always kind of been able to piggyback a little bit off his knowledge. I can just text him if I need a classical reference explaining. But I've never.
Always
You
good
had
to be
this
married to somebody with a different discipline than yours, so that you can
exactly.
just have a
I can
reference
help
point.
him with English literature, and I've always, honestly, I have always felt kind of intimidated by classics because I did a little bit at school, but it's not my wheelhouse. Okay, and I really love this line in your book where it was something like, "The classics is not above you; it is for you." I thought that was so beautiful. And anyway, could you just start by telling us how you discovered that classics was for you?
Yeah, absolutely, I can, and thank you for that. It's certainly close to my heart, and it's you're right. I hate telling my life story because I just never know which parts to include, but this part always is included. I kind of go back to, I have this core memory of lying on the floor in my grandparents' Manhattan apartment reading Richmond Lattimore's translation of the Odyssey. And this was like the first grown-up book I ever got to read. Feel like we probably all have that memory of like the first time we read something that wasn't kind of a concession to our childhood. And for me, it was the Odyssey. And like, you have to understand, these grandparents, they were the kind that would let you watch as many cartoons as you wanted. So like, to be reading Homer instead of watching Wile E. Coyote was just it was
It's
something
an
about it was
eccentric
really
choice.
gripping. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what it was, I think, is, I, even before that moment, I had just been so lucky to grow up surrounded by books. Um, my parents are both sort of literary types. My dad's a novelist. And I had to kind of grow up and go out into the world before I realized that this was actually really weird. Like, this was not a normal way to live, and to treat books as kind of your staple was just an unusual thing. Because for me, it just was always really clear that being surrounded by books meant being surrounded by friends. Fundamentally, just pulling these things down off the shelves, even if there were things on there that I couldn't understand and all of that. I remember very vividly just that sense of companionship that I experienced early on. And as you kind of indicated, that feeling of being of companionship, of being accompanied, of being surrounded by friends is not kind of the usual assessment or approach to the canon or the classics. And there are sort of two alternative stories about what those bookshelves are, what those great works are. One of which you indicated, and that is that they are a kind of fortress designed to keep you out. They are the sort of forbidding list of things you must read in order to be considered worthy and acceptable. And if you can't grok them, if you can't get with them, then you're found wanting. And then the alternative and kind of follow on to that view is the view that the whole thing is misconceived kind of axis of oppression to begin with. And because they've been used as gatekeepers, they kind of represent oppressions of various kinds, retrograde attitudes about sex and race and all this stuff. And I was just very fortunate that I knew from experience that neither of those things was true. And as I grew up and developed and read more, I actually realized that my experience of companionship, even though it was out of fashion, was actually kind of the common experience of a lot of these supposedly scary writers. I mean, Machiavelli writes to Francesco Vettori when he's in exile that despite being kind of out in the boonies and having to work with his hands and all this stuff, he takes off his dirty clothes at the end of the day and he enters the ancient courts of ancient men and there communes with them graciously, Cicero and Livy. And that's kind of the classics that I recognize. When Du Bois says that he crosses the color line to shake hands with Aristotle, that's sort of the secret society, the great communion that drew me into it in the first place, and still really is why I do what I do. I mean, obviously, as you suggested, there's sort of a lot more like technical learning and stuff that goes into it at the graduate level. But I've felt very disillusioned with academic classics, partially because they kind of felt like they were taking me away from that sense of communion. And so my career ever since then has sort of turned back toward just trying to usher in as many people as I can to as much of that storehouse, that kind of resource as possible.
Can I read out that Du Bois line, actually, because you've reminded me of it, and it's so beautiful, and I wish I could quote it verbatim, but I can't. So I've looked
Oh,
it up. Hang on.
okay.
I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the colour line, I move arm in arm with
Mm,
Balzac and Dumas, while smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. Yeah, and then he goes on to mention classical writers as well. Yeah, I mean, it's such a beautiful idea to be
mm,
able to speak with the dead, right, in that way. But so many people, as you say, don't feel as if there is anything much to, it's the dead white men
mm,
objection that we're so familiar with. I mean, I'll say to my shame that it took me a long time actually to
mm,
get over the progressive assumption that is instilled in our education systems of all places nowadays,
mm.
that there is something suspect about old things, rather than the exact opposite, which is that if an idea, if a text has persisted for a very long time, that says something in its favor.
Yeah.
It seems that we have that exactly backwards, right?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think some of this is understandable in that we're facing, in many ways, unprecedented challenges. We're dealing with technology that I think represents as radical and seismic a shift as the printing press did. I mean, I think we're at that level, that kind of 500-year level of transformation. And so many things are emerging that either we've never seen before or that take a form we've never seen before. So we'll have arguments about like what is truth, for example, which is a very, very old question, but they'll take place in the context of artificial intelligence and fake imagery and stuff that can just be confected with increasing clarity and precision out of nothing. And one of the things that I tried to do in my book, and through the process of writing the book, I think one of the things I learned about myself and about why I love old books is that by looking at how these problems have presented themselves in the past, you can start to kind of grasp at what about them is essential and what about them kind of strikes at the core of our humanity, which has two, to me, really salutary effects. One is it creates this wonderful feeling of knowing you're not alone, that these issues are actually perennial, that the questions they raise are, that, have been shared by other people, have been wrestled over by other people. G.K. Chesterton says that the fellowship of men is even more moving when it reaches across centuries than when it reaches across nations. And I just find that a really touching thought. But then the other thing that this kind of communion does is it allows you to get to the heart of some of these things, and understand sort of what's driving a lot of the craze over, I mean, post-truth politics. The book deals with transgender stuff. I mean, all of these kind of issues that seem really daunting and disorienting. Yeah, it's actually a point in a book's favor if those sort of things have been dealt with 100, 200, 300 years ago, rather than 5 minutes ago on CNN, which is, I think our impulse to turn to that is very understandable when everything seems so new, but it's actually probably the opposite of the direction we should be going in.
I want to talk about some of the ways in which we are similar to ancient thinkers. The fact, yeah, I agree. The human nature has basically not changed for a very long time, and to assume that it has is a very dangerous political mistake, right?
Mm.
But can we also talk about some of the ways in which the ancients were different from us in some of their central assumptions? I mean, my husband always likes to joke that, the idea of calling Aristotle white,
Mm.
for
Yeah,
instance, it's just like,
absolutely.
right? Like he would, I mean, from the get go, the fact that we're not Greek would be an enormous,
Oh my
enormous count.
gosh.
It would really count against us, right? In his vision of things.
Right, the
Um,
fact that we're speaking this barbarian tongue would be the biggest
right? Yeah,
problem. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what are the some of the central things that you think a reader of these texts needs to understand about the different ways actually in which, let's say, Athenians viewed the world? Like what are some of the priors that they had that we just do not have?
That's a terrific question. I mean, the black and white one is a really great example of. I think this may be the fault of us Americans. You could tell me if you think I'm wrong, but because our central racial trauma, and it is a real historical trauma, takes place across this divide between black people and white people, the invention of black people, which is in large part kind of a product of the 19th century, gets retconned backward into every moment of history. And then all conflicts are kind of understood in terms of it or analogized to it. I mean, this doesn't just happen chronologically. It happens, with Israel and Palestinians. It's, which one of these groups is sort of more like black people in the American South and which one is sort of more like white people is like the implicit question that's being asked again and again. So that sort of thinking makes it very difficult to do what you always have to do, as you say, when you're approaching a kind of distant time frame, which is try as hard as you can to kind of lay aside the frameworks that you use to look at the world and see what's the same and what's different. So this is one, the kind of racial divide. It's not that there weren't prejudices in the ancient world, but as you indicate, they would have taken place along very different kind of lines. I mean, another example of this is sex, which we are used to thinking of in terms of these kind of immutable orientations. And that too, sort of a product of the 19th century, whether we, endorse it or not, sexual orientation is not a concept that's particularly useful for thinking about, what's going on the battlefield in Rome. I would say, power and dominance is a much more useful way of thinking about the accusation against Caesar, for example, that he was a husband to women and a wife to men. That kind of thinking is even reflected in the Greek language. The words erastes and eromenos are two masculine words that are just the active and the passive form of the same verb, essentially. And so, that's a kind of radical shift that has all sorts of implications also for thinking about male and female, manhood and womanhood. And there's even differences there between the, sort of Jerusalem side of the Western tradition, the Hebrew texts, and the Greek and Roman texts. And then the other one that I think is really difficult for us to wrap our head around is about the sanctity of human life and even the universality of humanness. I don't know if you're familiar at all with Tom Holland, but he wrote a book a few years back, Dominion, uh, in which he described his own realization that as a classicist, as a student of ancient history, he couldn't actually recognize himself in, for example, the Spartan practice of throwing babies off of cliffs, because there was just a fundamental assumption about, you know, who deserves to live essentially in there. And it's easy to take this and start shading it over into evil, nasty ancient people. They kill babies, nice, good Enlightenment children. Like, we love everybody. That's not the case at all. But what it does enable us to do, I think, is notice points in the ancient world, places like, the Stoa of the Hellenistic era, or of course the biblical tradition, where this notion of universal humanity, mankind in the image of God, as the Hebrew Bible puts it, starts to emerge, because it actually is emerging against the governing assumption, in contradistinction to what most people think, which I think is a very humbling and even, in some sense, kind of frightening realization that is missing from a lot of our debates about, well, who was good and bad in the past, which has become obviously a major flashpoint. You know, there's a kind of assumption that, it's, if it's a self-evident truth, then it just means everybody who is basically decent has always recognized that human life is, of infinite value, and always worthy of preservation and all this stuff. And we don't even understand, we're inheritors of such a rich and deeply embedded tradition. We don't understand that it's by far not a given to believe and think that. And so, of course, I do believe that, and I do think that, and I am a product of this tradition. But it also, I think, bears remembering that, we're actually not guaranteed that. We didn't just come up with it out of the resources of our own kind of personal virtue and goodness. And there, but for the grace of God, go we into all sorts of other things that we now recognize as, nasty and abhorrent. And then the final part of this, that I think is another kind of humbling aspect of studying the ancient texts, is that you then start to ask, well, if the people that I think of as nasty and backwards in the past were in fact people trying their hardest to be virtuous and to know the truth, and yet were totally blind to what now looks like a screaming, deficiency in their moral sensibilities, where are those in my life? I mean, this is what the Psalm says: cleanse me of hidden faults. And that's kind of part of the beginning of wisdom, is to realize that the world being in a tragic state as it is, we are always going to be emerging out of a kind of network of sin. And we may one day, because of our successes or progress today, look back on our present with horror. And we have to kind of accept that, but we also have to extend that grace, I think, to, all the generations of men.
Mm. I think I definitely sometimes fall into that trap you describe of um, leading with moral repulsion
Mm.
when studying the ancients. Infanticide, slavery, the list goes on, and I'm coming at it with a Christian sensibility,
Hmm.
which means that I find those things shocking. But you do, as you say, you do have to kind of. I wrote this essay for First Things earlier this year about abortion and infanticide, and it's called "We Are Repaganizing."
Mm.
And to some extent, what I was doing in that essay was making an argument to people who are pro-choice,
Yeah.
that there is something sinister about the pagan attitude towards abortion, infanticide, and indeed human life. But I also tried, and I continue to try to give them their credit as well. There is something very entrancing about paganism, actually. Obviously, I'm
Mm.
using the term very loosely, but the idea of uh, the gods as being a part of this world, is it so captures the imagination, and has obviously, of course, for so many generations of readers, it has a the Roman and Greek stories have I think a magical power which is not really replicated in any other culture.
Wow. Yes. That's very well put. And I think that, you know, I've just been reading in my sort of daily scripture. I'm trying haltingly to go through the whole Old Testament in Hebrew. And so I'm going like real slow, like verse by verse. And I finally made it up to the real bad times in the kingdom of Israel, and I'm up to the exile. And of course, human sacrifice becomes kind of the cardinal sin there of the Jewish people, that is the last straw in their exile. And it does seem that, the murder, the taking of innocent life, the killing of babies, and the kind of blindness to the evil of that, the blindness to the wrongness of that, is associated with these other gods who, as you say, also are hypnotic and entrancing. I mean, there's a reason that the Solomon, the wisest man ever to live, follows after them because of his wife, and there's a reason why there are all these constant warnings against them. Is, you know, I sort of have come to feel that worshiping some abstract power within the world is the default state of man, because something we've lost our sense of as our mastery over nature and our technology grows stronger is that the world still is filled with forces and patterns of change that are much more powerful than us. And we don't we don't imagine that we expiate those forces or that we bring sacrifices to them, because we don't call them by the same kind of anthropological names that the Greeks did. But the structure of what we do is actually now very similar. I mean, I'm making my way here cautiously, step by step, to an argument that we're actually seeing the return of paganism, and that you are absolutely right to associate kind of our abortion regime with pagan child sacrifice. And it's very easy, I think, to slip into like kind of Jeremiads about this, but I'm really just sort of making an observation about the structure of pagan belief versus the structure of what came to dominate the West, which is, monotheistic, moral, ethical monotheism, um, and Christianity especially. And so, yeah, now, like when Apple makes a video in which Octavia Spencer just walks on camera as Mother Earth and says, I'm an angry goddess that demands you sacrifice your productivity because I will rebuke you with, the laws of nature. They think that's a joke. I'm not so sure that it is. In other words, I think that's a perfect depiction of what many modern environmentalists sort of believe. And environmentalists are not the only ones. Abortion activists have their kind of Ishtar to worship, and they're not the only ones for whom, like, in the absence of Christianity or after Christianity, the world has started to look very pagan, and the old gods, or what the church fathers might have called the demons, have started to come back.
I'm interviewing the historian Diane Purkis soon for the podcast. I don't know if you ever crossed paths when you were at Oxford. She's
Hmm.
in a different department, but relatedly,
Yeah.
she's interested in British folklore in particular, and she wrote this amazing book about fairies. And the thing that really jumps out in reading about British ideas about fairies is, one, how much of it is borrowed from classical stories. And
Hmm.
actually, she says that there was a surprising amount um, of trade, both literally and in ideas, between Celtic bush isles, and it's not. She thinks that actually some of these stories have come from Greece and Rome over a very long long way,
Mm-hmm.
but also that these do seem to be quite instinctive ways of understanding the world. The idea of nature, spirits, the idea of um, I don't want to call it superstition because that sounds dismissive, but the idea of the world being enchanted, often in extremely sinister ways, does seem to be quite an instinctive feeling in humans. And it's one that can coexist reasonably comfortably alongside monotheism, but sometimes there are sources of conflict,
Mm.
And my feeling reading this book, I tweeted about this at the time, was that wow, where is all this belief in fairies gone? We have this like rich tradition of British folklore and kind of folk religion. Where's it gone? And I googled it, and it turns out it's not gone anywhere. An enormous number of people still believe still believe this stuff. Just not me. Apparently, I'm left out. I don't throw salt over my my shoulder. I'm not scared of black cats. Any of this stuff, but like clearly, I don't know, astrology would be one example though of people still being drawn towards something that looks a bit like paganism. Environmentalism, I completely agree with you. Gaia is a vengeful god of the old style, right?
Yeah. And all the idols promise you the same thing. They promise you control over nature, because if you
Hmm.
offer them stuff, you'll get stuff back.
Yeah,
But,
transactional, yes.
right. But then they demand sacrifice, right? They'll
Mm.
demand you kill your child. They'll demand you impoverish yourself, that you starve, all this stuff. Um, the fairies thing is really on point, and this is kind of my new pet obsession in some ways. I mean, Mary Harrington's out there writing about how the fairies are returning as the electric lights kind of start to contract, and she was on my podcast, Young Heretics, and said something that I thought was really smart, which is, the world's getting reenchanted, and you can say that it's an egregore that emerges from the collective kind of online trends of human psychology, and you can make this long explanation, or you can just say demons, and increasingly those words are becoming more direct and exact, and basically convey what we mean, interestingly independent of our sort of different metaphysical assumptions. Like, there's a lot of different metaphysical standpoints from which it is now possible to talk about demons and about fairies and about all of these supernatural entities. And you touched on astrology. This is my new book that I've been working on. I've been talking about it a lot in Young Heretics. Is a kind of a history of science from this viewpoint. Um, and one of the things that set me off on this is a passing comment by C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, in which he says, we think of the Middle Ages as the high noon of superstition and magic, but actually there was very little magic under the medieval church. And it was the dawn of science that saw a really flourishing interest in magic. And you think, well, why might that be? Well, spells and scientific experiments have almost exactly the same epistemological structure, and always have. It was the Chaldeans in Babylon who were both reading entrails and learning to chart the paths of the heavens, or the planets across the sky. And it turns out entrails don't actually accurately predict the outcome of events, but the movement of the planets across the sky does have a logic. And we kind of dismiss all of that as, astrological mumbo jumbo. But their fundamental insight, which was true, is that, you know, if you understand the logic to these things, you can predict the future. And if you can predict the future, you can intervene and make changes. And my favorite fact from this era is that, the Babylonians used a base 60 counting system. So in the way that we go up to 10 and then start again, they would go up to 60 and start again. And this is the reason why we have 12 months, why we have 12 stars of signs of the zodiac, why there are 360 degrees in the triangle, why, why that number keeps recurring in many of our mathematical. So that foundation remains. And then in the scientific revolution, I mean, Kepler practiced astrology until the day he died. Newton was writing commentaries on Hermes Trismegistus and the Emerald Tablet and alchemy. They all basically thought there was something in it, and what they thought in it was what they extracted out as science. which means that in the structure of our scientific language, there are all sorts of words that sound physical to us, but when we start to examine them, they actually turn out to be spiritual or immaterial. The first person to make this objection of all people was William of Ockham, who's often accused of the kind of heresy, and was accused of heresy because of his sort of nominalism. But it was his nominalism that enabled him to say, as the concept of momentum was coming into being, like, you guys think you've discovered this new thing called momentum, but where is it? Like, how do I touch it? Where do I find it? This is true also of gravity. This was Leibniz's big example of an accusation against Newton. Kepler toyed with calling the force of gravity the anima motrix, the moving soul of the world. And so when you start to kind of unpack some of this stuff, you realize, like, none of our paganism went away. It just got kind of papered over with this Latinate gloss that makes it sound impersonal and lifeless, except that all of the things that those words, when you open up the box of those words, you end up finding, what? I don't know, spirits, essentially.
Mm. I agree with Mary. I mean, Mary is the patron saint of this podcast, right? She's here in the room with us now.
Yeah.
She's completely right about demons.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I was joking to a Catholic friend recently that, like, I'm not really sure if I believe in God, but I think I definitely believe in demons.
Yeah. Yes.
In
I mean,
this,
so do lots
yeah, yeah,
of horror movie makers now. I mean, if you watch Mike
yeah,
Flanagan, that's what he believes. He believes in demons, but no God.
yeah. I mean, in the sense that in the sense that I think that describing someone as being possessed by demons is more emotionally accurate than
Mm.
describing someone as having some sort of biomedical problem, which is
Mm-hmm.
not to say that there isn't something happening at the molecular level which is producing what you see, but, like, in terms of the most direct way of actually describing it,
Mm.
that spiritual vocabulary and those spiritual models are, I think, more useful.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think I agree with you, and I think I've noticed recently that it's also actually more compassionate. One of the reasons I think we all shied away from using language of demonic possession is it sounded and was often very accusatory. You've opened yourself up to demons, and that's because you're bad, and you've got some sort of moral deficiency. But the premise of demonic possession is actually that we are not the only ones that are entirely to blame for the brokenness of the world, that there is a larger kind of hierarchy of evil that has imprisoned us. And, I think it's Augustine who says, our obedience is or our disobedience is lesser than Satan's disobedience, which is why we're capable of salvation and forgiveness and all this stuff. And there's a wonderful moment in one of the demonic possession stories in the gospel that has always haunted me, because you can't really get it across in the English, but in the Greek, there's this man possessed by a demon, and the Greek calls him something like en daimon is dominos, or something like he was the demoned one. He was the endemoned person. And it's only when Jesus approaches him and starts to speak to the demon as something that's inside the man that the human being has a kind of separate dignity and life outside of this foreign imposition. And so the narrator kind of adopts, I think, our assumption, which is like this person is somehow broken or bad. And then Jesus, as like the first step in his exorcism, says, no, this is a person, a child of God, with a foreign evil entity inside of him. And some of that stuff, I think, like, we could, as you say, we could sort of do with a lot more of it in our thinking about what we can now call mental illness and so forth.
I listened to a fascinating podcast recently. It was an episode of the Pints with Aquinas podcast, which some listeners might be familiar with, and it was a, like 2 or 3 hours interview with an exorcist,
Ah,
and it was just
wow.
like like really, really interesting listening, but also very disorientating listening for someone who, I say I believe in demons. I'm not actually as attuned towards the enchanted world as many people are.
Mm.
I've never been drawn to astrology. As I've mentioned many times on this podcast, I find the metaphysics of Christianity harder to grapple with than I do the cultural and moral ideas. I'm not actually that woo.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly most people are. And in fact, I think trying to expunge the woo
Hmm.
from humanity has been a terrible mistake, because what we end up doing is just either being utterly miserable or being drawn to worse beliefs, or finding places. I mean, I was thinking as you were describing these the biblical accounts of demon possession, uh, the the popular form that you will now mostly see those kind of ideas in now is like children's fiction and science. I was thinking of Harry
Hmm.
Potter. You know, a Horcrux, Harry's Horcrux. You know,
Yeah.
the shard of Voldemort's soul is kind of a demon, right? Like, which
Yeah.
is like and obviously there's so much Christian and pagan influence in Harry Potter, but people still clearly want this stuff. They really, really want this stuff, but it's as if it has to be confined to the world of entertainment.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we talk about the um, the demon movie, the exorcism movie. And don't get me wrong, I just rewatched the Exorcism of Emily Rose. I think it's one of the best you know depictions of spiritual reality in quite some time. But there's something to what you say that's worth highlighting, which is the Bible's often presented as if it says, don't practice astrology and don't practice divination because it doesn't work. It's not rational. And God is going to teach you sort of the right mathematics that will give you the truth of the future or something. But that's not what the Bible says at all. In fact, the Bible usually says things like don't mess around with astrology, with crystals, with divination, because it's very real, because it is, in fact, an existing force in the world. And usually the way of talking about it is these are the other Elohim. And interestingly, in our translations, we tend to sanitize this language because I think many modern Christians are sort of afraid of attributing what the Muslims would call attributing partners to God. That is, admitting the possibility that there are other gods, or flirting with polytheism. But the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, is quite forthright in saying things like, there are other gods, and they are essentially fallen angels, demons. They're powers that are greater than you, but not the greatest power. And God's claim, the claim of Adonai or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh or whatever the name is of this one God, is not to be the only supernatural intelligence in the world, but to be the source of all other existence and to be the highest supernatural intelligence. Um, and right, as you indicate, like there's sort of a range of different ways that you can attribute consciousness or not attribute consciousness to these other entities. And at the end of the day, it becomes less and less clear why it matters, like what the distinction is or what difference it makes, because they act as if we can talk about them as if they were, foreign entities, and they act sort of that way. And certainly the way that people treat them creates this little like silhouette outline of a intelligent being that we're all forced to reckon and interact with. Um, and so, yeah, hard to know why we wouldn't just talk about it that way, irrespective of where we are vis-a-vis like theological metaphysics.
Mm. Bring back angels
Yeah,
and demons.
exactly. Well, if you're gonna
Yeah,
have the demons, I mean, you might as well plunk for the angels. That's the other thing. Otherwise, it's a bleak world out
right, yes.
there.
um, to change subject from demons,
Uh-huh.
although, by all means bring them up whenever they crop up.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier uh, ancient attitudes towards sexuality being different from ours, and you write about this really well in the book as well. Um, it's worth, I think, dwelling on that for a moment, because I wrote years and years ago now an essay about the debt that transgenderism
Mm.
owes to dualism, in that this idea of your soul having a distinct gender identity which is separate from your body is actually incoherent in most cultures, right? Most interestingly, there's this anthropology book, again published at least 20 years ago, before this was really controversial, called Travesti, which is about Brazilian transsexual prostitutes, and the very different way that Brazilians understand not just transgenderism but also sexuality. In that, I think, although I want to hear your view on this, they took a more classical view of it, in that it's not so much about the how to say this elegantly. It's about the penetrator and the penetratee are the
Right.
crucial sexual roles,
Right.
rather than masculine and feminine per se. And I think, am I right, that that is also a more classical way generally of understanding sexuality?
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly a classical way, and different interpreters will differ about to what extent it was the only or the dominant way of thinking about these things. But it certainly emerges to an extent in Plato, in the Symposium. And I think part of that might be because of Plato's habit of thought that tends to take individual particular instances and view them simply as kind of tokens or examples of some larger abstraction. And this is like a big subject to bite off, but why not charge boldly into it? I mean, it like the whole thing about the forms and the ladder of love and these famous elements of Platonic thought are that our momentary day-to-day experience, any individual instance or event, is kind of best and most fully understood as one instance of this much larger abstraction and kind of eternal absolute ideal. And one of the things that I think this does is lead Plato, at least, to think about erotic relationships less and less in terms of the embodied particularities of physical congress, which might invite you to consider the difference between men and women, and more to think about, yeah, roles of penetration, right? Who's putting in and who's receiving. And in the Symposium, famously, this gets very intellectualized. Like, it ends up being about teachers and students, and how when you are kind of overflowing with an idea or with the thought, you need somebody waiting and ready to receive some beautiful soul. And this will then lead up ultimately to a kind of communion with the beautiful in itself. And then there's, like, that very lovely set of Platonic ideas, and then there's the very much also present, incredibly crude application of it by, like, soldiers raping captives in war, and just these, much more aggressive power dynamic ideas about sexuality and who counts as a man and who counts as a woman. And so, yeah, in all of that, both the kind of ostensibly rarefied and in the crude and aggressive, I think there's, like, a lot of the same kind of thinking that seems to obtain in radical transgenderism. That, like, your body is, if it's not a total accident and just a postmodern lump of flesh, then what it actually is kind of one distant emanation of the transcendent soul that is you. And that, your task in life is kind of to express endlessly or embody endlessly this perfect divine spark. And I guess one reason why I hesitate to associate this with the classical Greek view altogether is that, for me, one of the most powerful answers to that whole way of thinking comes from Aristotle, who says, okay, there are such things as abstractions, and there are such things as, forms and all of that, but we never encounter them except in the flesh, except embodied in some kind of matter. And so where is this, like, abstract man, Aristotle might say to a transgender person? Like, you say that you feel like a man, that your soul is male, that you have a, male gender identity, but, like, point me to it. Like, what is it? Where is it? And this remains the unanswerable question for radical gender theorists to this day, is like, what are you talking about? And why should I treat it as anything other than essentially a theological or a spiritual claim, and kind of a dubious one at that? Um, the Christians, especially after Thomas Aquinas, were much more convinced by the Aristotelian account that says, no, in the first chapters of the Bible, God breathes his breath into a lump of clay, and it's that fusion of breath and clay that becomes a nefesh chaim, a living soul. So even your soul isn't actually really this kind of ghost in the machine or some airy floating thing. It's the structure and the form of your body having life. So yeah, I mean, I think that in the classical tradition, we can find resources for thinking our way out of this kind of purely power dynamic or purely disembodied idea of sex and sexuality. But we can also find, I think, the roots, the very deep roots of that way of thinking, which I think have to do with just the discomfort of living in a fallen body, and the eternal temptation to Gnosticism, and all of this stuff that is now very much in evidence.
Could you explain to listeners, and indeed any podcast hosts listening, what Gnosticism really means? Because because I see it being thrown around a lot
Yeah,
in
yeah.
relation to transgenderism in particular, and I've never quite wrapped my head around what it means.
Okay. Well, me neither. But let me say some things that let me say some things that have been helpful to me in my
Okay.
perplexity. Um, so the root word of Gnosticism is gnosis, knowledge. And so it's actually kind of appropriate that it's a word that people keep using without knowing what it means, because a foundational premise, or like a major kind of operating feature of Gnosticism, is that it represents secret knowledge that the masses can't attain. And therefore, it must be something about the world that isn't immediately apparent from your everyday experience. And so Gnostics of every variety pride themselves, and often even represent themselves as like a select elite who have learned the truth where everybody else is deluded and deceived. And so then I think the question becomes, in what way and according to what problems are they deluded and deceived? And it usually has to do with the relationship of the spiritual world to what we would think of as kind of the obviously real world, the everyday. Um, and I like to think of this as ultimately cashing out in some terms of the matrix theory. Like, somewhere you're going to get to a point of view that everything that seems obvious and real to you is like a simulation, or is like kind of a imaginary act of deceit. And in the Gnostic Gospels and some of the kind of post-Christian texts that we have that give us some insight into Gnosticism as a heresy of Christianity, because it's not only that, but it is that it's a heresy of Christianity that reaches back into like Neoplatonism and certain strains of Jewish, I guess, heresy as well. It will often, these texts will often treat either the God of the Bible full stop, or the God of the Old Testament as a deceitful demon, as having represented himself as God, but actually being a renegade demiurge, somebody that God had appointed to build the world, a la Plato's Timaeus, but who went wild and deceived us and trapped us in our bodies and trapped us in the world of the flesh and the spirit. This guy's name is like Yaltabaoth, I think, in some of these texts, and elsewhere he might even be associated with Lucifer. In this way, it's very closely related to the Marcionite heresy, which is the heresy that the Old Testament God is bad, evil God, and New Testament God is good, nice, daddy God. And there's different versions of that, but you can see, probably as I am groping in the dark for a good description of Gnosticism, why it would be readily associated with the belief that your body is as an encumbrance, as an hindrance, as a hindrance, probably because it was given to you by this, nasty deceiver god, and certainly because it's your most direct conduit to the world of the senses, which in turn is the thing that everybody knows. So that can't be where the truth is because it's way too accessible. It must be in a retreat from the body, in a kind of rejection of the body. And so when people, as I just sort of flippantly did, use Gnosticism to talk about transgenderism, they're doing it because, that impulse or that retreat away from your embodied self, your treatment of it as a kind of as an insult or something that's beneath you, something that needs to be rewired and reconfigured. That's a very Gnostic impulse. And it does also come along with, and this is also Mary's point, it comes along with all sorts of, claims to secret knowledge. Like if you're the initiate, if you're the elect, if you're woke, you'll say the right words, you'll know the right things. And if you're on the outside, you're, cast into the exterior darkness.
To what extent do you also think that the deep suspicion of the body, which is manifest in transgenderism, but not just in transgenderism, that the horror of motherhood that you will hear from some sort of
Mm.
young antenatal progressives also is very rooted in a fear of the body,
Yes. Yeah.
um, and to what extent do you think that also actually has its roots in Christianity? I was thinking of particularly, I'm thinking of the holy anorexics
Hmm.
of the medieval period and the sort of spiritual um, ascension to be found in rejecting the body. Do you
Yeah.
think that persists still in some of this kind of gendered body politics that we find ourselves experiencing?
Right. Well, first of all, I think Gnosticism is a Christian heresy for a reason. In other words, it's something to which Christianity, among other worldviews, is susceptible. It's a kind of
Mm,
you can easily see how you get from actual Christianity to that sort of misinterpretation of it.
mm,
And then I think, yeah, you have to grapple with the role of women and the feminine in Christianity, because I do think Christianity has both an idea of, women as a sort of biological phenomenon and an idea of womanhood, which, even though it is never separate from embodied, womanness, is in fact also has a spiritual quality and a spiritual dimension. And the best way that I can put it, again, speaking very broadly and acknowledging that other people are going to have like wildly different interpretations of this, is, frequently Christians are prone to say that the Virgin Mary undoes the sin of Eve. And one of the things I think we mean by that is, you know, through pregnancy and through giving birth to this sinless child, the Son of God, um, Mary embodies and represents the promise that flesh is not actually doomed altogether to death, that it can, in fact, give life and can embody new life. And Mary is in this, I think, kind of the type of womanhood in this way of looking at things, which is not to say that, pregnancy is the only way to truly be a woman for Christianity, but just that in just the same way, to use a rough analogy, that like a man in war is kind of an archetype of manhood, but you can be manly if not in war. Mary, in her pregnancy and in giving birth and in her labor pains, is um, an archetype of womanhood. And what I'm about to say will help explain one reason why I personally am profoundly opposed to some Catholic theological ideas like that Mary didn't suffer labor pains or that she remained perpetually virgin or all of these other things. Because for me, what's so profound and beautiful about the Immaculate Conception and the virgin birth is that it affirms this about the human body, and it says basically the act of giving birth is your most direct sensory evidence of the fact that the flesh is a conduit for life, that it actually can take on life in the way that, bronze takes on the shape of a man, that flesh has this like amazing ability, human flesh has this amazing ability to create new life. Um, and that's what the incarnation does. Also, right, famously, childbirth's very painful and uncomfortable and difficult, and involves also distorts the body, and also causes all sorts of crazy things to happen with hormones and things that people often have considered kind of a burden and an imposition, and that the Bible does represent as a consequence of the fall, right? That is kind of one of Eve's big consequences, is that she will bring forth children in pain. And my way of reading this would be to say, like, yeah, because now that sin and death have entered the world, there is something in the world that actually like gnashes its teeth against this sacred thing, which is the embodiment of the Godhead and of the soul in human flesh. But of course, it's very easy, again, to slip into instead what has often been said, which is like, you know, your pregnancy is kind of your sin, right? Like the things that are going wrong with it, the things that are hurt about it, all of that is like, you know, that's kind of your fault because like you were there with Eve when she ate the apple and all of that. Um, to me, this is very wrong, but you're absolutely right. I think I sort of suggest that it's a strain of thought that then leads us directly into all of that antibody stuff and all of that kind of recoiling from the flesh and recoiling from the body. And I think there's a reason why, to bring this back to like transgenderism and all of that, there's a reason why so much of this third or fourth or 12th wave feminism, or whatever you want to call the Judith Butler era, I'm sure you can educate me more clearly on what exactly wave it is, but like,
You teach me about narcissism, I'll teach you about
yeah,
the
exactly. If
different
you could
waves of
please fill
feminism.
me in on like where we stand, that would be helpful. And no, but one thing about it is it does trend always to this horror of womanhood and a horror especially of pregnancy. And the sort of, on the label it doesn't say that. It's not expressly theorized except in certain really extreme cases that like womanhood is worse than manhood, often just the opposite. But like, where does all the rapid onset gender dysphoria set in? It's among prepubescent and pubescent girls. And I think there are both like spiritual reasons why that would be, and really obvious kind of philosophical reasons, which is this does to me kind of represent the latest strand of a perversion, a Gnostic perversion of what Christianity is actually kind of getting at with its story. I mean, it's like heresies are so funny because they're just like a hair's breadth away from really beautiful and important ideas half the time, and Gnosticism is sort of one of those. And so for me, it's like the role of Mary and the role of women in Christianity is kind of to the most sublime way of dealing with this at a spiritual level. But hopefully I've now rambled enough that you can sort of see how it shades over into all of the stuff that transgenderism also represents.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.